Charles Dickens never forgot what it was like to be a poor child. Even when he became very rich and famous, he campaigned constantly against child poverty, in both his journalism and especially in his novels. He understood that getting his message across was a very easy thing to do in his works of fiction. That was when people really took notice. Dickens felt very keenly that children in the 19th century were often at the mercy of adults. We see many of his child characters whose lives are blighted by the adults around them, such as the children in Fagin's gang, the Artful Dodger and his friends, all of whose lives are being shaped by Fagin, Bill Sikes and other adults. In the Old Curiosity Shop, we see little Nell at the mercy of so many adults. This building is one of the oldest shops in London, and although it's almost certainly not the actual shop that Charles Dickens was thinking about when he wrote the Old Curiosity Shop, he definitely knew this place here. One of Dickens's most mourned child characters, little Nell, is a victim of poverty. She dies because, as Dickens believed, the world was too cruel to sustain a little Nell. Little Nell was one of Dickens's favourite characters. It's said that when he wrote about her death, he cried as much as if one of his own children had died. A couple of years later, Dickens continued the theme of child poverty, a cause about which he was passionate when he wrote perhaps his most famous work, A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol was written in 1843. It had been written after Charles Dickens had been commissioned to write a government pamphlet about child poverty. Dickens started to work on the pamphlet, but then he thought, what's the point in writing this? Who's going to read it? A couple of MPs, it'll be put away, no one will see it. So what he did was he wrote his most famous Christmas book, A Christmas Carol. Many people know about Ebenezer Scrooge and the ghosts of Christmas, but many people forget the two central child characters to A Christmas Carol. They're the children who appear with the ghost of Christmas present. Their names are Ignorance and Want, and they were the main reason that Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. It was his protest song against child poverty. In 1824, Charles Dickens' father, John Dickens, was arrested for debt and taken to the Marshalsea Debtors' Prison in Southwark, South London. For a while, Charles Dickens had to live by himself, just north of here in Camden Town, because Elizabeth Dickens and her children went to join John in the prison cell at the Marshalsea. After a few months, John received a legacy from his mother, which enabled him to come out of prison. And for a while, for nearly 4 years, the family lived in a house on this site. It's now called Cranley Street, but at the time the Dickens family lived here, it was called Johnson Street. Charles Dickens was able eventually to leave the blacking factory, where he'd been working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week as a child labourer, and go back to school for a couple of years. When he was 15 years old, his father was arrested again. He wasn't imprisoned this time, but Charles had to leave school and find a job to help support the family. Charles Dickens moved to number 48 Doughty Street in 1837. While living here, he wrote some of his most famous early novels, but it had taken him a while to get to that point in his career. After leaving the blacking factory and going back to school, he then worked as a solicitor's clerk, a job which he hated. He taught himself shorthand and he became a freelance journalist. He then realised that what he really wanted to write was fiction. In this house, he completed Oliver Twist. He also wrote Nicholas Nickleby, both of which featured child characters very prominently. In Oliver Twist, Dickens exposed the cruelties of the workhouse and what the lives were like of the children who, like Oliver, were born there or who were placed there as young children. In Nicholas Nickleby, he exposed the cruelty of the Yorkshire schools. These were boarding schools that unwanted children were sent to, where they were neglected, abused, treated horribly. Dickens knew about the Yorkshire schools because of his work as a court reporter. He went to Yorkshire to research the schools, and he wrote about what he found there. The Charles Dickens Memorial on the Marylebone Road is at the site of his home at Devonshire Terrace. He moved there in 1839 when he and his family left Doughty Street. This memorial shows many of Dickens's loved child characters from the novels that he wrote while living at number 1 Devonshire Terrace. These include David Copperfield, seen with Mr. Micawber. And David Copperfield is often said to be Dickens's most autobiographical novel. David Copperfield's experience working in the wine warehouse echoes Charles Dickens's own experience of working in the blacking factory. a place that Charles Dickens talked about in his unfinished autobiography. David Copperfield is not the only child character who's autobiographical. In Great Expectations, Pip and his longing to be a gentleman, his feelings of class inferiority, echo much of what Dickens was thinking about as a little labouring hind, as he talks about in David Copperfield, a child who he felt was thrown away by society. Both Pip and David speak to Charles Dickens' insecurities and his desire to make something of himself in a world that seemed to be very much against him as a little boy. In the memorial, we see Barnaby Rudge with his pet raven, Grip. This was actually the very first idea that Charles Dickens had for a novel, although Barnaby Rudge was the 5th novel that he published. The raven, Grip, who is Barnaby's constant companion and one of the wisest characters in the book, was based upon Charles Dickens' own raven. He had a pet raven named Grip, who he adored. When Grip died, after being very naughty, prizing off the lids of tins of lead paint and drinking the contents, Dickens was distraught. He called several vets and he recorded all of Grip's last words. After Grip's death, Charles Dickens had him stuffed and placed in a glass case. This he placed above his own writing desk so that the raven could inspire him while he was writing. In 1852, Charles Dickens was approached by a group of doctors. What they wanted was to set up a new hospital entirely for children. This was a totally radical idea. It was a very poignant year for Charles Dickens because in 1852, his and Catherine's daughter, baby Dora, died in infancy. Baby Dora was the only one out of their 10 children not to survive to adulthood. This was extraordinary in a time when 1 in 3 children in London were dying, but Charles felt her loss so keenly, and he wrote articles persuading parents to take their children to this new hospital that was so heartfelt. A few years later, Great Ormond Street Hospital went back to him. They said that his campaign had been so effective, they were going to have to close. They had too many parents bringing their children to hospital. And so Charles Dickens started fundraising. He raised a huge amount of money. It's said that in one night, at a speech he gave at a dinner, he raised £3,000. This was in 1858. His fundraising was so effective that the owners of Great Ormond Street Hospital were able to buy the building next door and double the size of the hospital. Today, Great Ormond Street Hospital continues. It's a world-class hospital for children, and it's all thanks to those early campaigners, including Charles Dickens. Perhaps the best way of summing up his legacy is this quotation from Great Expectations. "In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice."